check your email regularly today. The university keeps updating us on the weather forecast and what to expect. I would like to thank you all for taking part in those who turned up yesterday in such a horrible weather to play football. We had 60 teams, and I was really amazed and surprised because I thought, guys, well, I was there, but I thought most people wouldn't turn up. But I was surprised that mostly, like everyone who signed up for this tournament turned up, and we had a really fun day. And it was a really nice day. And I think it's something that you will not forget, because I don't think you have ever played football in such a horrible weather in your life. So I haven't. I'm not gonna forget that day. It was at some point I just can't see the ball, I can't see the players, I can't see anything because of the snow. So thank you so much for making this day really special to me. I really enjoyed that day, and hopefully, if you like the idea, we can have another tournament when the weather is nicer. So it's my fault. Next time I'm gonna make sure that I'm gonna check the weather forecast. So hopefully it could be after Easter. So just make sure the weather will be nicer. But well, you know, here in the UK, you shouldn't trust the weather. Anyway, so let's start with so thank you all for making this day successful and unforgettable day. As I said, we start with the feedback from the previous lecture. Well, I was pleased to see that people start preparing for the lecture. Of course, I had other feedback from you, other comments from your side, but one of the very nice things that I've seen people like, because one of the questions I asked on Socrates last week, whether you have prepared for the lecture and seminars and how, and I saw some like people starting looking at the material before they come to the lecture, making some effort to read about the what we are going to discuss in the lecture, etc., which is very pleasing and makes me happy to see. So the average score went slightly up, which is again so what I do when I ask you at the end to rate the lecture from 1 to 5, and then I get the average just to see how you think about the lecture on average and as a whole. So let's start just looking at what we should be doing today. So before we start, as usual, I would like you to sorry, this is not the right room number. I didn't change this. This was last year. So it's the same room number. It's Echo Swans, the same one we've been using from the first lecture. So Echo ECO Swans SWANS. So please log in. Answer the first few questions. I think one of the questions about last week's seminar. So I have to highlight this again and again and again. I will keep saying that until we finish, until the end of this term. Participating in the seminars is extremely important. Seminars complement what we do in the lecture. So sometimes we discuss in the seminars things that we didn't cover in the lecture, and this is not something done by like intention. It's just the way the module is structured. So it's all about debating and discussion. So because seminars give us the opportunity to discuss this in a smaller group, so that's why sometimes there are some points, some issues that I raise in the seminars that probably was not covered in the lecture. So why is that important? Well, why is it important to you? Because it will come in the exam. So that's I think that's a good reason, or this reason is good enough for you to attend seminars. So please, if you didn't attend the seminar last week, just next week, as I said, there'll be no seminars this week. Next week, please attend the seminar, and I will let you know about the additional lecture we will have on the coursework. So in that lecture, we'll discuss again. We started this discussion last week. What we expect in the coursework, what sort of content we will be looking at, what sort of examples we can include in the coursework. But we'll continue this discussion in that lecture, in the additional lecture or the extra lecture we have next week. Okay, so now let's start the last part on the theory part. So as I explained in the first lecture or the second week, we explained that theory is important. It's important to understand the theoretical background. Ideologies and theories inform policy making, and that's why we need to understand where these coming from. So that's why we dig deeper, and we want to know where this comes from. What is the theoretical background behind this? So we started with mercantilism, and we explain how nationalists today, or nationalist policies, or what we can call what we called inward looking policies, how this could be related or could be linked to the idea of nationalism and mercantilism. Okay, so there are some roots from history here. So and the way people think and the way policy makers think, which is liberalism. When we talk about liberalism, we explained if you want to put these two in comparison, we compare these two together. So mercantilism we started with, or the analysis is based on the idea of the nation. Liberalism starts with the analysis of, or the idea of individuals. So societies are just some of our group of individuals. So we don't need really to think of the society as a whole or worry about the society as a whole. We just need to worry about how to make markets free, free from the government intervention, how to create that environment that will enable individuals to maximize their own goals, to maximize their own gains, and then this ultimately, or by the end, or by default, will lead to the whole society maximizing its welfare and gain as well. So there are no conflicts here, and as long as we ensure that this limited role of government then and free markets, so the free market mechanism, if there's any distortion or any deviation from equilibrium, so the market system would have its own correction mechanism that will lead us back to this. So for example, if we think of unemployment as a liberal policymaker would say, well, unemployment is just a result of we have surplus in the supply of labor, and this should, if we have free market, this should push wages downward. So that means it will be cheaper now to hire workers, and this will stimulate, will encourage investors to hire more people, and then this is the self-correction mechanism now. So this is what Adam Smith called, do you remember? The invisible hand. So there is an invisible hand embedded into the liberal system or market mechanism, free market mechanism, that would ensure that if there is any temporary deviation from equilibrium, we will go back, it will correct itself, going back to equilibrium. And the example I gave to you now is about how to explain unemployment, for example. So as I said, it's extra supply, or we have a surplus in the supply of labor, and that surplus means there's a pressure. So many workers are competing for few jobs, and this would mean the wage level will drop, and that will encourage demand, or encourage investors to employ more or to create more jobs. Again, so how would that happen? Like if you have free markets, but if you have a government that intervene in the economy, the government that put or restrict this the mechanism by which free markets operate, then these we're not going or this mechanism is not going to work as it should be. Okay, so again, there's another example I gave last lecture as well, which is I think is important to understand how when I talk about why are you here, why are you doing this university degree, were you concerned about the workforce, were you concerned about the society or about yourself? We agreed that we are here because we are concerned about ourselves. But in the same time, this would benefit the whole society. Okay, so if you are educated, if we have an educated workforce, then this at the end will benefit the whole society. So this is the idea of liberalism. Okay, so this is something, and then we were talking about international trade and how free trade, how to explain international trade. We talked about comparative advantage, absolute advantage of Adam Smith, the comparative advantage theory of David Ricardo, and then we moved to explain the why international trade or free trade should or is expected to, according to liberal views, it should promote peace and stability, and this is something that we probably discuss next week in the seminar in detail. So going back to what we should discuss today, so if we look at these two theories, we're looking at what we called, or what we classified them in the first lecture as capitalist theories. So now we're looking at the other side. So we're going to look at Marxism, imperialism, dependency theory. So these are different from, or if we group these together, we could call them economic structuralism. This is the title for this topic today, economic structuralism. So how is it different from what we did last week and the week before? We explained, okay, so economic structuralism, so it has different variants. We looked at we will look at Marxism and interdependency and imperialism, but Marxism is different from the other theories because Marxism is not a capitalist theory. It has a very different argument. When we talk about mercantilism, we talked about wealth accumulation, how nations can be wealthy and wealthier. Okay, so with liberalism, we're still heading toward the same idea, how to benefit or to be wealthy or wealthier. So still, it's just through different routes. Yeah, with mercantilism, you have the government need to lead, the government need to control economic resources, etc. Market mechanism is the way forward to accumulate wealth or to be better off, etc. So both are actually going toward the same idea of accumulating wealth. But if we look at Marxism, this is evil, this is bad, this is something that we shouldn't, or this is something that will lead to conflict in the society, and we'll see what we're going to end up with according to Marxism. So this is what we're going to cover today, Marxism, and that's the main idea, and the dependency and imperialism and dependency theory in that way, or in this order. So these two theories, there are differences between Marxism and dependency. Imperialism is just another, is an extension of Marxism, and we'll see how now. So, but there are differences between Marxism and dependency theory. So both, they share concerns about international division of labor. So we look at poor countries, rich countries, etc. So we'll see the idea of exploitation, and both they share these concerns. Capitalism divides the world into poor and rich nations. So both agree. So dependency theory and Marxism both agree on that concept. But Marxism totally rejects capitalism. Dependency theory probably seek to ways how to reform capitalism. Okay, so we start with Marxism, and it's all starts with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and these were German economists, philosophers in the mid-19th century. They developed a theoretical critique to capitalism. These are their books, The German Ideology and The Communist Manifesto, and these were motivated by what they have witnessed at their times. So what did they see at their time? They saw advanced capitalist nations like England. They saw the Industrial Revolution in Europe, how agrarian and rural nations moved or shift toward industrialization, how there was a shift from using basic tools to powered machinery. They saw the development of steam engines, factories, massive factories, iron and textile industries, etc. So they were motivated by what they have witnessed at their time. So this led them to take a step back and look at the whole system and just think about what is coming in the future, what this system will produce in the future. So in describing this system, they say, well, capitalism divides people into classes, okay? So people now became owners and workers. So you rich or poor, you either rich or poor. So owners own everything. They own the factors of production, all means of production. They have all the power. Workers, they do all the work. They work for them. They make them rich, but they have no power. Okay, so it all started from here, from the idea of exploitation and how this division happened. And of course, because capitalism is evil, capitalism, I'm just talking from their point of view. So because capitalism is bad, wealth accumulation is an evil idea, it led us to have this divided society into workers and owners. The owners, they've got everything, they do nothing, by the way, and they are rich, they have all the power. Workers, they do all the work, but at the end of the day, they have no power. Just think of this division and keep this in your mind during the lecture today, because we're going to be always talking about division, how exploitation, and how this will turn to conflict, and what this is going to lead us to. So if you look at this, for example, we've got like 4 lovely people here. This guy, which seems to be happy, he say, this machinery is very productive, so he's very proud of himself, okay? And I own it, so here's the owner, yeah? And that's what he does. He's happy face, like got this happy face, nice glasses, watching the workers while they doing their job. That's why I'm rich, that's why he's rich. So on the other side, if we look at the workers, so the first one, but you didn't build this machinery. Well, it was built by workers. The other one, and you don't operate it. So it's operated, it's run by workers, okay? So workers do all the job here. Well, the third one would realize, okay, in fact, you don't seem to do any work around here at all. So they are miserable, but he's happy. He's the owner, he owns that machine, he's rich, he does nothing. Workers, they build that machine, they operate that machine, they make him happy, but they have no power. And that's the whole idea about Marxism. It's exploitation. It's the idea of division. Okay, so where is this going to take us or to lead us? So according to Marx, one day workers will realize this, will understand this trick, how capitalism divided the society into workers and owners, and how owners, because of that system, exploit workers. So once they realize that they are being exploited, then they will rise against their owners, sorry. So they will rise against the owners, and then they will try to get rid of the owners' control of society. Okay, so how far would that go? Well, if we carry on with the analysis, because of the government system is a way of empowering the owners. Remember, the owners own everything, they do nothing, they are rich, they have all the power. So the government enforced their control of society. So the government is a system that helps capitalism to carry on. So it helps the owners to exploit the workers, and that means we will come to, you see this conflict, and that is the idea. There's a conflict in the society will lead to a revolution, and that revolution to overthrow both owners and government. So the society or workers who had no power in the past, or because of capitalism, because that evil system that divided the society into two groups, then when workers realize this, once they realize this, they will rise up against them, and they will get rid of both the government and the system that empowered the owners. So in Marxist view, the revolution is a natural outcome. Okay, so just think about it, because when we talk about imperialism, we'll see that this natural outcome idea is different. So here in this theory, or Marxism theory, giving that this brutal repression, workers' revolution is a natural outcome, it must happen in any nation at advanced stage of capitalism. So you need to go to that point where the exploitation at maximum, like when you are advanced stage in capitalism. This is the idea about it, and they predicted that this should start, or is likely to start first in England, and it probably will take longer in other societies like France and Russia. Okay, so what's going to happen post-revolution? So let's say now, let's just imagine that what Marxism, or what Marcus told us happened. Then the natural question to ask, well, owners now, or sorry, the workers, they overthrown the owners and the government. So what sort of society we would have after that, which is the post-revolution society? That's what Marx described by communism. Communism, a system with no private property. So no one owns anything, we all own everything. So that's the whole idea. So all property is owned by everyone. Then since workers are the owners, so now this division is no more exists, so it's not there anymore. Then there will be no exploitation. Everyone will be happy, because everyone will get what they need, and everyone will contribute as much as they can. So this is a very ideal notion about a society. So anything you will need, you will have, and then you contribute as much as you can. So that is the idea of communism. So this is how it was described. So we'll see later in reality what happened. Okay, so any questions? Any question about the idea? So let's watch the video together then.
On the ideas of the philosopher Karl Marx. Marx was born in Germany in 1818 and died in London in 1883. He's buried in Highgate Cemetery in North London. Marxism is what is known as a conflict theory, because it states that society is in conflict with each other, and Marxism claims that this conflict is between the rich and the poor. Now, Marxism, as we understand it as sociologists, is a political and economic philosophy, a view of the way things are now, and suggestions as to where society is headed. The danger is that we start to view it based on what we understand about its relationship to communism and the politics and oppression of the old Soviet Union. Marx never saw communism in this way. He saw it as liberation and as a leveler, a way of creating a fairer society, and of a way of getting the best out of all people, not just those with money and power. To really understand Marxism, we need to start with its opposite, capitalism. Capitalism represents the type of society you and I live in today. In Marx's terms, it's an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production. What this means is that our society today is based on a few people who own factories, businesses, shops, and other corporations. These corporations aren't owned by the people who work for them, the employees, or jointly by the employees and the owners, but by the owners only. Marx was formulating his theories during the Industrial Revolution, a time when Britain and other countries were going through a very dramatic change. The old feudal system, when lords of the manor owned the land, meant that the ordinary people had freedom and rights to all land. It was held in common. When the government passed a number of enclosure acts in the 1700s and 1800s, ordinary people no longer had the right to live on this land, and many of them were forced to pack up and move to the towns and the cities, which were beginning to grow due to the increase in factories and textile mills. Whereas previously people were free to keep their own animals and grow their own crops on common land, once they reached the cities, they had to find work in the factories, in the employment of the factory owners. The work was hard and often dangerous, and the pay was very poor. Many factory owners didn't want to pay high wages because this would mean less profit for them, so children were often used as cheap labour. The Industrial Revolution promoted a capitalist way of thinking, what we call a capitalist ideology, and also created two distinct groups of people. The factory owners, who were middle class, Marx called these the bourgeoisie, and the workers, or working class, Marx called these the proletariat. Marx was on the side of the proletariat because he saw them as being treated unfairly by the factory owners. Not only did Marx see them as being treated unfairly or being oppressed, he also saw the system as one that tried very hard to make sure that the poor stayed poor and the rich continued to get richer. So Marxism views capitalist society as being based on a system that encourages inequality, because the rich will always need someone to do the work they don't want to do. It's called a conflict theory because society is in conflict, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. However, Marx also suggested that at some point the working class would realise that they had the power to change things. Through education and personal development, some members of the proletariat would begin to understand the system better and devise ways of changing it. Marx believed that such radical change could only come about through revolution, when the workers rise up and overthrow those who were treating them unfairly. In place of capitalism, a new system would be established in which all people were treated equally and all the factories and businesses were owned by everyone. In other words, they were communally owned. Marx called this system communism.
A summary or a brief of exactly what we said now. It's about the conflict, the division, how this will lead to a revolution that will create a new society, or which is based on communism. So what I want you to do now, just on Socrates, if you've heard now an idea, or you've got now an idea about what Marxism is. So what I want really you to do now is just to tell me, how did you see this? Is it something that, does it make sense to you? Is it something that we see today or not? So please just log in on Socrates after we now get an idea about what Marxism is, and I'm sure many of you should have heard about this before, these ideas before, so probably it's not new to some of you. So just tell me what you think, you personally think about these ideas. Do they make sense? Are they relevant to us today? Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll come back to continue with the next part of the lecture, which is we're gonna move to the idea of the imperialism theory, and how is this was based on the ideas of Marx. And that's why we started with Marxism, because what is coming next will be basically is just very similar to what we said now. So please, on Socrates, just tell me, so you don't have to write too much, just one or two sentences, just explain or to tell me whether it makes sense today or not. Is it something that you think is relevant today or not? or how you see this, how you evaluate what you've seen today. So we have a capitalism, we have a system where people are divided, or the society is divided into classes, and one group exploit the other, and etc. So, and that will create this sort of conflict, and the conflict should lead, or is expected to lead, to a revolution and changing the structure or the way the society looks like. While you answering these questions, let's have a look at this before this video, before we start the next.
But in the history of the modern world, there has never been a communist country. This might come as a surprise, but in the history of the modern world, there has never been a communist country. While a number of countries have described themselves as communist, for example, China and North Korea, by definition, there has never been a true communist country. So what exactly is communism, and how does it relate to socialism? Well, it may be easier to explain what the two have in common. Both ideologies originate from a desire to limit worker exploitation and lower or eliminate the influence of economic classes in society. There are dozens of variations on both communism and socialism based on the different ways these ideologies are implemented in different countries. There's Stalinism, Leninism, Trotskyism, Maoism, and others, which are essentially all versions of Marxism, coupled with various styles of revolution. Karl Marx was an economist and philosopher who co-wrote the Communist Manifesto, among other foundational books on communism. In short, his theory centered around the idea that as Europe transitioned from centralized monarchies to quasi-democratic capitalist economies, workers were being exploited by those who owned the means of production. So if you work in a factory or on a farm, as many at the time did, whoever owns the factory or farm is getting more out of the worker than they're putting in. This creates an inherent inequality, giving the owners, who Marx called the bourgeoisie, power over the workers, called the proletariat. In Marxism, to fix this inequality, society must shift towards a model where the proletariat hold this power instead, by collectively controlling the means of production. That's where socialism and communism come into play. According to Marx, socialism is a precursor to communism and the next logical step after capitalism. In socialism, a democratic state controls the means of production, rather than having private companies hold ownership. Instead of competing with each other as in a capitalist society, socialism has workers contribute as much as they can to the greater good, and then they all share equally in that good. Variations of this idea are already popular within capitalist societies in the form of universal healthcare or social services like fire departments and schools funded by taxes. While the use of these services is unequal, everyone is equally responsible for contributing to them based on their ability or level of income. So that's socialism. But once the state controls all the means of production, the next step is total collective ownership, not just of production, but all aspects of society and economy, including private property. The intention of abolishing private property is a classless, moneyless, and stateless society, where everyone works towards the same collective goal of being healthy, happy, and free. Everybody does what they can to contribute and takes only what they need in return. As I said before, there are no true communist countries, and there never have been. Every so-called communist country is actually a socialist country, with the state controlling employment and economy to some degree. Even the widely referred to communist Russia was actually called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In short, socialism and communism are not altogether different. Rather, most schools of economics consider socialism to be a precursor to communism once the state has enough control over society and economy. But this total control is a major reason that socialist countries struggle to reach this ideal. Corruption is rampant in countries like the former USSR, Venezuela, Vietnam, and North Korea, largely due to people in power abusing that power instead of using it to help the society they control, and refusing to give up that power to the people. Nonetheless, socialist ideals have seen incredible success when paired with capitalism in countries like Sweden and Canada. The human hurdle of overcoming power and greed in government is the biggest reason we've never seen a true communist country.
What we will do next is look at imperialism, which is introduced by Vladimir Lenin in Russia. He's a Russian politician. And what he did he wrote a book, this book, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So what he basically did, he applied these ideas, Marx ideas, on international relations. So just if you probably, you should have asked that question, why should we study Marxist if we are doing international economic policy? Why should we care about ideas about the society and the conflict? It's just because this has some extension afterwards. Is the idea of exploitation could be extended to nations as well, so to the entire world, and that's what exactly Vladimir Lenin did in his book, or explaining his book, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So the idea here is wealthy nations exploit poor nations. So it's the same idea of exploitation. So it forces people into slave labor, steal resources, dominate and impoverish the poor. So it's connected to colonialism, where a time when Europe controlled almost the rest of the world. So if you look at this map, this was European colonialism between over 500 years. So all this map, all these colored maps, so these were just how these are split between European countries. So it's nearly it's almost the whole world. Okay, so and that's the idea. So how does this work then? So if there's exploitation, if capitalism and the system we have create a division between nations where rich nations exploit poor nations, then the next step, according to Marx, we should have a revolution. Okay, and that is the idea. So one day, poor nations would rise and overthrow their colonial masters. They would reject capitalism. Remember, in the society, we would reject the government because this is the system that empower the owners. Is the same here. So capitalism is a system that's linked with colonialism, and that's why we should reject it. And then this will take us to communist societies. So there's only one. There's a very important difference, which about how the revolution will happen. With Marx, what we just heard is a natural outcome. So once the society reaches a certain level or an advanced level in capitalism, then the workers will rise against the owners. But according to Lenin, and exactly what happened with him is that, well, poor nations do not have to wait for the revolution to happen naturally. So with Marx, the revolution was a natural outcome. So it's something will happen. Just need time. Give it time and it will happen. But with Lenin, so it doesn't need to wait. You don't have to wait until it happens. All what you want, all what you need is a political leader that can create that revolution. So when that happens, then when it happens in one poor country, other countries will follow. And guess who was that political leader? It was Lenin himself. He started that. So that started in 1917, and that was the first Marxist revolution. It was led by Lenin himself, and it seized power in Russia. Okay, so you see how ideologies have impact or inform policy making, and it results in changes in history as well. So and that was the first one, and then after that others followed. So other nations. So the idea of Vladimir Lenin here is that you don't have to wait for a revolution. You can create it. You can make it happen. So you don't have to wait years and years until it happened naturally. So you can do it. And this is exactly what he did. And other countries followed him. So if you look to this map, this is the communist bloc. All these countries just became part of what it was known at some point communist bloc. So if you look at this is Germany. So East and West Germany. So this divide Germany into East and West Germany. So all this red area here in the map, on this map, is the communist bloc. And just remember, it all started with Vladimir Lenin. So, so the idea here is that we're going to have a 10-minute break. I know I'm going to ask you if you want to vote, if you would like to have a 10-minute break. But just let me just sum up what we said so far. So we started with Marxism. Marx, the idea is very simple. So capitalism divide the society into workers and owners. The owners own everything. They have all the power. They do nothing. The workers, they do everything. They have no power. One day, workers will realize that they are being exploited by the owners. They will rise against them. They will overthrow them because the government is part of the system. So they will get rid of the government system, and this will result in communism or communist society, where everyone we're sharing everything. So no one owns everything. Everything is owned by everyone. So and that is that was the ideal form of society that you may have. But I mean, according to Marx. Then Vladimir Lenin, he actually took that idea and applied this idea on international relation, and they say, well, we've got a system where of capitalism or colonialism where rich nations exploit poor nations. One day, poor nations will realize this. They will rise against rich nations, and revolution will happen. But we don't have to wait. So this is the difference. So we don't have to wait until that happens. We can actually create it, and that's what he did. And this is what you see. That was the results of what he did. Okay. So the difference here, or the main difference here, is that revolution doesn't have to be a natural outcome. We can actually make it happen. So I will stop at this point because we'll assess or evaluate this idea of imperialism, and then we'll move to the dependency theory afterwards. So before I do so let me just ask you if you would like to have a break or not. So please raise your hand. We are in a democratic society here. So please raise your hand if you want to have a 10-minute break. Okay, so I think it's majority, but let me ask the other question. So please raise your hand if you want to carry on without a break. So I think the majority want to have a break. So sorry. So I'll have, then we have 10 minutes break, and we'll come back to discuss imperialism and finish dependency theory. Thank you. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. So just before we start, we're just going to watch this video, which basically, guys, do you want to finish early? Yeah? So let's start now. So what we're saying is that we're going to look at, we're going to watch this video. It's a very short video that talks about how imperialism might be relevant today. Okay? Again, as I explained before, so when I discuss something with you or I show you something, it doesn't necessarily mean that these are my views or this is what I believe in. Just to show you different sides of the same argument. So let's just look at this video. Watch this video.
What is imperialism? Imperialism is when a very powerful country takes over all or part of another weaker country. Imperialist countries take control of other countries so that they can take as many of the other weaker countries' resources as possible. For example, the powerful imperialist country might take the weaker country's oil or forest products. Powerful imperialist countries take over other countries by using soldiers or money. They use soldiers when they decide that they can only take over the other country by using military force. In this case, the powerful imperialist country sends their army to invade the weak country. The army kicks out the weak country's government, and they take over. Powerful imperialist countries use money to take over countries by building big businesses in the weaker country. By putting a lot of money into businesses in the weaker country, the imperialist country can start to have a lot of influence over what happens in that country. if they have enough big businesses running in the weaker country, the imperialist country can control the economy to make sure they make the most money possible. For example, the imperialist country would make more money if they forced the weaker country to have very low wages and very few rules about safety in factories. Imperialism still exists today, but it's unusual for imperialist countries to use military force to take over other countries. However, it still happens. For example, Russia recently used military force to take over part of Ukraine. Russia did not want the rest of the world to know what they were doing, so they tried to keep it a secret by having their soldiers wear uniforms with no military markings. Nowadays, imperialism usually involves taking over the economy of the weaker country. Basically, imperialist countries make as much money as they can from other weaker countries. They don't care what happens to the people. Imperialism is all about rich countries making money without worrying about the consequences.
Okay, so again, this is one side of the story. Okay, so as I said, you always are encouraged to think of both sides of any story. But anyway, so we'll just move on then and look at what happened in reality. So according to Lenin, if we have a political leader that is willing to or is able to make that change, to make revolution happen, then we'll move to we should move to the next stage, which is projected by Marcus, which is communism. Okay, so in theory, well, once the revolution happened, then this is something should happen by default. But what actually happened, we have a communist ruler. Okay, so we have got, or if not one, somebody who ruled the country, not just a dictator in the country, he controlled every aspect of the society. Okay, so and I'm talking about the experience from history. That's what happened exactly, and they take total control over every individual. That person's words are law. So whatever he says, it's just like law. So you shouldn't risk your life by saying no. So you have always to agree with anything. Otherwise, you will be the enemy of the state. And by the way, this is funny because if you look at, I can name a few countries, and I think one of which is Egypt. So you'll see many people in prison today because they are declared as the enemies of the state. So that's your crime. You're the enemy of the state. So be careful. Okay. Anyway, so you will see this model in different places. It doesn't have to be a communist ruler. Okay, because the problem here is that the absolute power. When you've got somebody who got absolute power, that's the problem. That's how dictators would explain or understand Marxism. So now we're moving towards a government or a communist ruler who ruled the country, control every aspect of that country. He's not questionable, by the way. No one can question his actions or his policies or anything. So, and as I said, you could lose your life. It's not just being in jail, by the way. But okay, so my point is that this is for rulers or people who would benefit from these sorts of theories, would use it in their advantage. They just to maximize their gains, to make them more powerful, and this will result in more close economies and nations. Okay, so just think of in reality. So what we were talking about the first half of the lecture, we were talking about theory. Yeah, so when this come to practice, we need to test these theories. We need to test these ideas. They are very ideal. They're very good. Yeah, they sound really good against exploitation, etc. So now we should be moving or heading toward this communist society where everyone owns everything, no one's own anything. So because it's owned by everyone, so we get all what we want, we work as we can. It's a very ideal, lovely, happy society, but this is not true. This is not what exactly happened in reality. What went wrong? We had people to rule nations who understood this as having absolute power. It's a way to gain this absolute power, is a way to categorize people into groups. This is the enemy of the state. This is somebody that we should get rid of. Anyway, so let me just stop at this point, like just discussing this. But this is what we had in when we apply Marxist or Marxism theory. So this is what we ended up with. So one of the very important issue with this sort of ideas is the reward system. Why should I work? Why should I work if I'm going to have what I want? Remember, that's that's communism, yeah? So you will, not what you want, sorry, what you need. So if your needs are covered, somebody else make sure that you get all what you need. So what is the incentive here? And this is the idea. That's what Marxism, imperialism, all these sort of ideas they ignore. And this is one of the powerful ideas in capitalism. Incentives. So give people incentive. So you are here because you have the incentive to be here. You want to learn. You want to get a good job. You're gaining from this. So you have your own incentive. So you're always trying to maximize your gains, and that is the clue, or this is the answer embedded in the capitalism system, which is again, it's not part, or it is missing from Marxism and other theories. So let's just move on. Then I'm not gonna play that video, so please feel free to watch it later, so it can explain the difference between imperialism and capitalism. But we don't have time to look at that one. So I just would like to move to the second or the last part in this lecture, which is dependency theory. So we saw Marxism. Imperialism is just an extension of the same theory, the same sort of ideas. We saw how what we had in reality when these theoretical ideas or ideologies were applied in reality. So it didn't work very well. But then when we move to the last part of the lecture, dependency theory, which is, again, it's about exploitation. It's about the same sort of division, but in a different way. So again, we have the basic idea here is that rich nations exploit poor nations. So again, we just carry on with the same idea, but capitalism needs reforming. So capitalism is not that bad, but there are issues that we need to think about. We need really to consider if we want this system to work. So poor nations are dependent, or they are dependent on rich nations, even after colonialism. So at least economically dependent on those countries. And this is where the idea of dependency theory comes from. So the capitalism system is the motive behind, or the motive force behind dependency relations. And that's what we're going to explain now. So the basic assumptions we have here, we have international division of labor. So again, we're talking about division in the world economy. There's class distinction, and I'm going to explain what that means, and global capitalism, which is the bigger system, or the entire system. So let's look at how that works. So when we look at international division of labor, the first assumption about this that this theory makes, so economically developed countries or rich nations, they produce high technology, high tech, and industrial goods. That means it creates high skills, high wage jobs. So look at how the division, or where the division come from. When you look at less developed countries, poor nations, they are based, or they depend on primary products and commodities, low skills and low wage jobs. So the division come from here. So it's the structure of the economy, and that's why this is part of, we put this under economic structuralism, because with Marxism we're looking at the structure of the society, how the society is divided by class, so rich and poor, or owners and and workers. Here we're looking at rich nations and poor nations, and that's because of the structure of their economies. Rich nations, they can produce, or they produce high-tech and industrial goods, and that's why they create, or their economies are able to create good jobs and highly paid jobs as well. On the other side, we have poor nations. They depend on primary products and commodities, and they're not able to create these sort of good jobs. So the main issue here then, well, less developed or poor countries would produce cheap products, so minerals or farm products. And this means, again, the idea of division here, it's just applied on the international economy. So developed countries produce manufactured goods, and you could explain, you can understand the terms of trade here. It's not in favor of developing countries, it's in fact in favor of developed countries, because poor countries buy expensive products from developed countries, and developed countries, rich countries, would buy inexpensive or cheap products from poor countries. And the system that way, if the system continue that way, that means there is no way that a developing country or a poor country would develop, because if you continue to depend on a cheap product or selling cheap product, then, and in the same time you're buying expensive products, then how would you expect that your economy will develop at some point? So that means developed nations will continue to grow while poor countries will go into debt, and rich countries gets richer, the poor countries gets poorer. And that is the idea. So they didn't stop at that point. Okay, so the division is not only poor and rich. Even within poor, they are not one group. Rich countries are not one group. So developed countries could be divided further into center and periphery of the center. So center countries, these countries dominate all other countries. If you think of the US and Europe, on the other side, you could think of some developed rich countries, but they are not as powerful as these countries at the center, so which they call the periphery of the center. So these are industrial countries with limited global power. I mean, you could think of, I mean, these are just examples. You can argue against these, but this is not the point. So the point is just to make this idea easy to understand. So, and on the other side, if you look at developing countries are not one group. So you would have center of the poor. So the center, you could look at India, Brazil, and when you compare this to the periphery of the poor, some African countries, you would understand that poor countries are not the same group. So they're not the same. They're not that homogeneous group. So there's some heterogeneity here. So they're not the same, and that's why you could look at the center or the rich and poor, and within the rich you will have two. You have center and periphery. Within the poor you will have again center and periphery. Okay. So when we talk about the center, we're talking about the more powerful group. Okay, within each one of these groups. So how that works? So if you think of this as a hierarchical system, so center of the center and periphery of the center. So this is the rich nations group, and then center of the poor and periphery of the poor. So we're looking at the poor nations group. So a country where if a country falls in one of these, so let's say if this is a hierarchical system, so if a country fall here, so it would serve all countries comes above it on the hierarchy. So let's say even in the center, within the center, so we'd imagine that those countries are at the periphery of the center, they would serve those at the center. Okay, so again, so that's the idea. So center of the center is served by everyone. So if you look at center of the center, if you think of the US, for example, again, this is what dependency theory explains. So the idea here is that the system is structured in such a way that everyone would serve, or all nations would serve the center of the center, or this group. Okay, so class division. So now we looked at the first one, the international division of labor and how that work. But within this division, there's another division, which is the class division. So within each country, you would have middle class or wealthy elites and the poor. These form a huge class in poor countries. So elites across groups will cooperate. So elites in poor countries will cooperate, so will work together with elites in the center. Okay, so what is the idea here? They want to maintain power and wealth, so to keep the system going the way it is, because it will enrich them. It will make sure that the rich will continue to be rich, the poor will continue to be poor. So this summarizes the whole idea. Okay, so if you look at this graph, you will see, okay, so this is the center, this is the periphery, and then within the center, you will have center of the center, periphery of the center. Within periphery, you will have the periphery, and the center of the periphery. So the idea here is that you will see this cooperation happening here between these different classes. So the middle class and these two different groups, they will cooperate together, and because they have harmony of interest, so they will actually make sure that the system continue to work the way it is. But the other group, which is the majority, so the poor here, they're not going to be able to work in the same way. So they're not going to be able to cooperate to resist or prevent the system from continue to working the same way. So this is like just a brief idea about what the dependency theory tells us. So we understand international division of labor, the idea of the class distinction. Then the only way that would work is that we would have a global system of capitalism that makes sure that these continue to be the same way. So again, just remember, these are not my views. These are what the dependency theory claims. So the idea here is that, okay, liberal economic theory dominates all aspects, trade, finance. So this, of course, would serve the interests of the core of the center, the countries at the center. Even international institutions, they are assumed to be part of this system. Global media, educational system. So we'd have like a global system that will make this system go on, and the rich will become richer and the poor will become poorer. So that's the idea. So the idea of exploitation. So the main idea here is that rich countries exploit poor countries, and the entire system is created to serve the interest of rich nation. So it doesn't serve the interest of poor countries. So if the system continues to work in the same way, that means poor countries will never become richer. So and that is rich. That's the idea. So the system is designed by default to work in that way, and that's why the system needs reforming. That's why we need to reform the system. Okay, so we need to make sure that developing countries or poor countries would have the chance to develop, etc. So there are different ideas about how to develop then. So if you want to develop, you need to depend, or you need to break this dependency link. So you need to be more independent economically, etc. But I mean, you could look at this later on. But let's just stop for a second before we just finish off this part and conclude the lecture as well. So how do you think, what would you think about this idea? So dependency theory. We've got rich countries exploit poor countries, and poor countries are not allowed to develop, so they are not allowed to grow by default because the system would prevent them from doing so. So they are not, it is going to happen. Is that something, how do you evaluate this idea? How do you think about this? Is this something, does it make sense to you? Is it like an appealing idea? No, why? Exactly. Yeah, so if you look at China, Brazil, and I think that actually this is one of the lectures we're going to cover, how developing countries like Brazil, China, India are expected to actually outperform, or they are outperforming developed countries at the moment, but they are expected to take over the system and to be the superpowers in the future. They're actually going to be, if you compare, for example, the Chinese economy, the growth of the Chinese economy to the American economy. So these are, if you look at projections, you'll see how China or Brazil or this group, BRICS as a group, how they becoming more powerful and important players in the system. So if dependency theory is true, then we shouldn't see these examples, should we? Well, again, you still can argue against this, but I'm just saying, if you look at the world today, if the system is designed basically to prevent poor countries from growing and developing, then we shouldn't have seen a model like China or Brazil or these economies that are growing now fast, and they actually becoming more powerful. Okay, so it doesn't matter how the idea in theory or what you're hearing sounds appealing, you still need to evaluate that idea and think about it. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about this more now, because I'll leave this to discuss in the seminar, because this is one of, and by the way, this is one of the questions in the exam before, so how to evaluate this theory and to explain it first, and then that was like a textbook style exam question. So anyway, so this is the idea about how to develop. Then you need to be more independent, etc. So you would expect, if you want to do that. But one of the other ideas as well, that international community would have some responsibility as well. So in terms of raising the price of commodities that these countries, depend on, import substitution, it's like some sort of policies that make you independent or economically independent. And that's what you would expect from a dependency theory, because the problem comes from being dependent. So if you are, or if you become independent, then you will be allowed, or you'll be able to develop and grow. So this is something this is an idea we'll evaluate in the seminar. And as I said, this was one of the exam questions. And again, the first part of the exam, or one question at least in the exam, is just a textbook style question, but the other question would be more like open-ended question. So I'll just give, this was, I think this came in last year, no, the year before, sorry, not last exam. So critically discuss the main assumptions of dependency theory, how this theory explain underdevelopment, and what it suggests to achieve development. So this is something, again, we'll evaluate and discuss in the seminar in more detail. Do you have any question about dependency theory, Marxism, imperialism, all these lovely ideas we discussed today? Any questions, guys? Okay, so let's, have you started preparing for the assignments? Okay, if you haven't, so just take this week, because we're not going to have seminars this week. Please use the time today and tomorrow, at least in the weekend, just to get some ideas. Just make sure before the next lecture, you get your groups, you get your ideas, and then I will be answering your question in the seminar next week. So next time we'll talk about American economic power, and then what I want you to do now, if you're happy, if you don't have any questions, please just go on Socrative, read this lecture and answer these questions. After that, you're free to go. So please, before you go, make sure you take part in this survey, please. Okay, as I explained before, it informed me, it gave me an idea about how you see the lecture, what you would like to see in the lecture, what you think needs improving in the lecture. Thank you so much for coming this week. And as I said again, no seminars this week. Next week we'll have an extra hour of on the assignment. So we're gonna mainly have this hour for just the assignment. We'll not talk about anything else. So please think about your ideas. Bring those ideas. Bring your questions with you next week. We'll have an hour to discuss these together as well. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.